Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to this segment of Coach Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. Our recitation is the 47th stanza or step of Bavan Akhari Mahalla Panjama, and the recitation first. Salok Hau Hau Karat Bihania, Sakat Mugdiya Jaan, Radak Bue Jyo Trikhavant, Nanak Kirt Kaman. Paudi Rada Rad Mita Sang Sadhu, Karma Taram Tat Nam Aradu. Rudo Jai Basyo Ridmahi, Ua Ki Taad Mitat Binsahi. Rudo Jai Basyo Ridmahi, Ua Ki Raad Mitat Binsahi. Raad Kart Sakat Gavara, Jai Hiye Aham Bud Vikara. Rada Gurmukh Raad Mitai, Nimakh Mahe Nanak Samajhai. So the letter of the alphabet that we are considering is Rada, from which the word Rad is formed. And Rad signifies an inner strife. It's a feeling of unrest that constantly grates on the mind. So it has this grating quality. That is what a Rad is. And that is the condition of the mind of the Sakat. And so the Salok begins by saying, we reap what we sow. Nanak Kirt Kaman. But the Sakat is a word that is used over 100 times in Gurbani and is translated variously, but technically it means it's hinting at worshippers of Shakti or power, the goddess in the Indian religious systems. It's pointing to tantric practices that were engaged in trying to develop occult powers through esoteric means. So that system, which was meant to enhance one's personal power, is really what a Sakat is that system. Nowadays, we can think of a Sakat as a worldly person who's caught in the rat race of material gain. This whole race of trying to be something at the level of the ego. So that's the Sakat that the Guru is talking about here. So he says that, look, we reap what we sow. So the Sakat reaps what the Sakat sows. The Sakat is intoxicated by the senses and out of ignorance is constantly asserting the prickly ego. What does asserting the prickly ego mean? It's always a constant fight to be something. But, the Guru points out, the ego is essentially insatiable. And so what happens is that the Sakat leaves the world dissatisfied, craving for more. Radakamue tyo trikhavant, thirsty for more. So what they reap, they sow. Now, the actions of the wayward Sakat create conflict. Rad Karat Sakat Gavara, because they stem from the ego. Jai hai aham buddh vikara. So the ego draws subjective boundaries that lead the mind astray into skirmish with others. So that's the external conflict. This inner conflict, the Guru says, that grates at us can be resolved by practicing what is the essence of all religious practice. Karamata ramata nam aradu. So, and what is that? Quite simple. That is Rarambete Sangasadhu, self-knowledge received through the agency of the Guru Enlightener. That is the antidote. Because then what happens is Rudo Jib Basyo Ridamahe. The beautiful self then comes to abide in the heart. And Uan ki Rad Mitad Binsahi. Strife ends. So essentially, it is a way of traveling from the psychological center we call the ego to the essential center we call the self. One is bound and conditioned by society and thoughts. The other is unbounded and fluid and flexible and mystical. But that is where you get to the source, and that is where happiness resides. So Nanak instructs us, Nanak samjhahe, to turn to the Guru Enlightener, to become a Gurmukh. And he says, if you do that, the agitation of the mind will cease. Gurmukh Rad Mitaya. And it will cease in an instant, the minute you realize the self. So if you recall, in the previous passage, the theme centered around violence and hostility. In this passage, the Guru tells us that it is our own inner conflict that is at the root of external disorder and violence. And the example of the Sakat is essentially pointing to us. We are caught in a web of our own making. The desire, as I said, to be something at the expense of others. And this conflict is what defines society and the world at large. So unless we resolve the inner conflict, the world will ever remain a place of stress. So this makes introspection into the nature of ourselves even more important, into the nature of the ego. What is the ego? Is it real in the sense of, does it have its own substance? Or is it just a social abstraction, a conditioning that society imposes on the mind, on the self rather, and creates a mind? Is it a process? And what does good wisdom teach us that brings lasting peace and happiness, which is what we all desire? So a hint that we get from here is that good wisdom tells us that unless you understand the mechanics of the ego, you will not be able to control it. And in order to understand it, you have to go to its roots. And roots are generally invisible. So the root of the ego is within. It's invisible to us. Therefore, it won't help for us to try and solve problems outside, because the root problem is inside. So therefore we have to deal with the inner mind, but we don't know quite how to, and that is the role of the Guru. On that note, until the next time, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.